So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to start our session today. On 250 years of Alexander von Humboldt, Humboldtian system science in the 21st century. And before starting, we have a video from the president of the von Humboldt Foundation. So I'd like to introduce that first. And Big, yes, sure. Try to make it.
Congratulations to the American Geophysical Union on its centennial. It is wonderful that this centennial coincides with the year. Congratulations to the American Geophysical Union on its centennial. It is wonderful that this centennial coincides with the 250th anniversary of Alexander von Humboldt, and I thank the AGU for the opportunity to join you in celebrating it. I send you my warmest greetings from Bonn, Germany, where the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation has its headquarters. When Claudio Facena approached me with the idea for this session, I was immediately more than glad to join you in the endeavor. Like him, many representatives of your union are also, as we say, Humboldtians, alumni of the Humboldt Foundation who have spent some time in Germany either as a Humboldt Research Fellow or as recipients of the prestigious Humboldt Research Award. Globally, roughly 30,000 of our alumni are active members of the Humboldt Network. More than 1,000 are in the Geosciences. Alexander von Humboldt was not only an outstanding scientist who changed our view of the world, he was also a great networker, a humanist, and science communicator. His spirit as a scientist is already apparent in his first major publication on the Bezels along the River Rhine. In this publication, Humboldt claimed that Bezels were sedimentary rocks. Obviously, he was wrong, but he later happily corrected himself. His motto, "Unveiling the truth is not possible without the exchange of diverging opinions," tells us how he looked at correcting oneself and being corrected by others. He presented it in 1828 in the opening of the largest scientific congress of his time, a congress that he had organized himself. Unveiling the truth is not possible without the exchange of diverging opinions. This, I think, is also a good motto for today, for the AGU fall meeting, but also for our societies as a whole. I wish you an inspiring exchange of diverging opinions to the benefit of Humboldtian system science in the 21st century. Thank you.
So thanks to Hanno Aufreide, for the secretary of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, for this introduction. And after that, I think we are ready to start. Yes, with the first speaker, that is Manfred Strecker. Yeah, the pointer, I mean, you can use it that. Would you mind to use the arms? All right, I have to do that. It's a Mac. Huh? Okay.
It's a Mac.
Yeah. So you maybe use it that.
So what have we here?
Nope. Yes. I recommend to use the points. Can you do that? I can take it out this. Maybe better. And you take the things.
To advance.
Yeah, to advance like
Okay.
here.
So now we need the mouse.
The mouse is here.
And the
Right.
okay. So we start now?
Yeah.
Because you got me down with 2 minutes already.
Yeah.
It's not good. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for inviting me to this session and for putting together a very interesting little symposium here on the occasion of Alexander von Humboldt's 250th birthday.
So I guess this is probably one of the most pretentious and longest titles of any talk that I've given in my career, but I want to address some of the important issues already in the title, and that is that basically von Humboldt was a person who was looking for knowledge, looking for understanding of the Earth system, and he called that unitary knowledge. In today's speak, that would be holistic knowledge and holistic understanding of how the Earth actually works. And this is brought out in his introductory sections in chapter 1 of, or in chapter 7 of the Cosmos, the first volume, where this is very succinctly represented what he was actually after. And when we look at the present-day definition of Earth system science, we see that it is basically the same kind of thing, that we look at the different elements of the Earth system on a global scale, and we're trying to understand the interactions and also the timescales over which these different processes have evolved. And this is where I would like to spend some time today to look at some of Humboldt's impacts on Earth system science as we understand it today. And I would like to do that, first of all, by looking at some of those transformative studies that he did, and then move into the aspect of transformation of his own thinking of the way we do Earth sciences and what everything means to us. And then we move on to a subject that was very important to him, and that was the comparative study of mountain belts, before we then, in the fourth part of my talk, will get into the Earth system science aspects that we're faced with today, but also in the context of Humboldtian science. So let's start here with the first slide. I understand we're at the American Geophysical Union, but I would like to start with painting here, because we have here Frederick Edwin Church's rendition of an Andean landscape that was dedicated to Alexander von Humboldt. And when we look at this in great detail, and we can do that because it is such a detailed rendition of nature in a volcanically and tectonically active environment, we can certainly see different elements of study that earth scientists or environmental scientists would like. And this was in the interest of Humboldt, who actually had instigated the Church, who was a representative of the Hudson River School of Painting, to go to Ecuador and work on this highly dynamic landscape. Now here, this is the reason why Humboldt was very interested in artists to go out and paint nature at the most possible detail, because he thought that landscape painting is basically a way to promote the study of nature. And he wrote at great length in volume 2 of the Cosmos about this subject. And therefore, it was, of course, important for Church to come along and come up with these very detailed descriptions of nature. At the same time, however, we have another school of painting develop, and these were the pre-Raphaelites. And John Ruskin, he himself a geologist, wrote a treatise on modern painters, and he claimed that it would be very important to understand our environment, the nature, not only from a very landscape perspective, but also from a very detailed perspective, going even into the details of individual clasts or pebbles that we see in this very nice picture of Brett, for example. So each rock would have the similar kind of significance and importance in understanding and in portraying nature as the painting of a mountain belt. And so this was in Humboldt's interest, but at the same time, Humboldt was very much engaged in working with people to illustrate his cosmos. And here we have the atlas that was put out by Bramme, and it is actually a testimony to early outreach activity, if we use modern vocabulary for that. And in fact, in this foreword to this atlas, Bromme talks about maps and graphs to actually help stimulate and educate the general public. And we can see Alexander von Humboldt, who then went into this very same vein of work, looking at the encyclopedic collection of temperature data, for example, that he then turned into the lines of isotherms, where we have lines of the different latitudinal sectors, and here we have the, sorry, go back, where we have the longitudes, and we can see that contrary to a belief at the time back then, the isolines, the isothermal lines, they are not parallel with the different latitudinal belts, but we have certain convexities and we have concavities in there that Humboldt then associated with the distribution of land and ocean. But also he accounted for the activity of certain oceanic currents. For example, here in case of the Gulf Stream, and here in the southern hemisphere, the northward convex protrusion of the isothermal lines that we see in the Peru current that was later on named after Humboldt also. But here he basically came up with this idea that the air ocean, as he called it, and the water ocean are linked. And this was picked up and put into the geological context by Charles Lyell, who immediately saw the importance of these lines of equal temperatures with respect to the position of continents, the position of islands, the position of oceans, and their impact on the temperature on the Earth, rather than just related to the solar insolation. And he took it even further by saying that if we move continents to a high latitudinal position, we would be able to change the climate in that sense that we increase a greater continentality, or as it was called then, an excessive climate versus an insular climate that was dominated by a more equal distribution of land and water. And in today's terminology, we would talk about a maritime climate. But this is very important because he also then took that concept even further into the explanation of climate change, as they had ways to explain the floras that were found in the coal seams of the Carboniferous in northern Europe, for example. So definitely there are numerous ways how Humboldt impacted our science, and we will see later on that is even much richer when we go into magnetism, when we go into surface processes, when we go into geobotany. I would like to go now into Neptunism, and as most people know, Humboldt was a Neptunist, as we heard before in the preliminary talk here, and Humboldt adhered to these ideas that were put out by his teacher Abraham Werner in the Montaigne Academy in Freiburg. But Humboldt's work showed pretty soon that these ideas are the ideas of the past, because in this rendition of volcanic eruptive centers, worldwide distribution of volcanic eruptive centers, we see already the belt in the Circum-Pacific region. We even see a volcanic gap down here in Argentina and Chile between 27 and 33 degrees latitude, where we have a flat slab and where we have no magnetism today. So this is all very exciting, and it prompted Humboldt and also Leopold von Buch, his contemporary, to suggest that the distribution of volcanoes is actually a more systematic kind of feature. It is not random, and it is related to internal forces, whatever these may have been. And along the same lines, and contrary to this Neptunistic thought, he was able to show that volcanic dikes would cut rocks of all ages and would not always be the youngest unit on the planet. And so this was contrary to what the current knowledge was at the time, and was pretty revolutionary. He also, and this is quite exciting, I think, when we look at this, he also, after his trip to Central Asia, suggested that mountain ranges are bordered by fault systems, without going into the mechanism that would cause the faulting there. All right, so there's then also the aspect of mountain ranges and the orientation of mountain ranges. And Humboldt recognized early on that in the old world, mountain ranges are oriented more or less east-west, with the exception of the Urals, whereas in the New World, they are oriented north-south. And he also attributed that to an underlying principle that is being determined by internal forces in the Earth, without saying what those could have been. And that brings us to the next point, and that is the comparative orology. And what we see here is a picture from Grotzinger and Jordan's textbook, Understanding Earth, where we see the distribution of the snow line and vegetational belts as we come from the equator, high elevations, and we go into polar regions where these belts are compressed. Now, Humboldt was exactly interested in the very same subject, and he has this beautiful description here of snow lines starting in the Ecuadorian Andes and then going all the way up to Lapland in the northern hemisphere. Now, while this is very interesting and an important recognition that basically snow lines and therefore vegetation belts and therefore perhaps rainfall, they seem to be changing in a systematic way, he did not show any dynamic features of the snow lines in these diagrams here. These snow lines are basically static. They are at a same elevation, and we know today that this cannot be the case, and we know that if we have mountain ranges that intercept atmospheric circulation patterns, that we get a highly asymmetric distribution of the amount of rainfall at the locus of rainfall, but then also in the vegetational cover and with respect to the snow line. And this is what we see in the next slide here, where he actually then showed very nicely that there are, in fact, asymmetric features in these mountain belts, in most mountain belts on Earth, where we see that kind of relationship. And this was taken further by others later on who studied mountain systems in a systematic way. For example, down here in Chile, where Pisces showed this very intricate relationship between topography, temperature, but also the importance of rainfall. So we don't have time to really go into all these different aspects of Humboldt's seminal work, but these examples were meant to show us a little peek through the window what Humboldt did, basically providing very important and significant observations in a variety of Earth system studies relevant fields. And now I would like to go, the very last part of my talk, into the challenges of the Earth system science studies as we know them today and the linked processes that we're facing today. And I would like to do that in the context of what Humboldt did for us before. And in a way, the studies that we do today, they're very similar to that what Humboldt did, because they are multi-temporal studies. We look at different timescales, we look at different rates, we look at different durations of these processes, and they're multi-spatial, of course, because they cut across different physical boundaries. This is something that has always been the same, but we see also here that these processes may cut across territorial and functional jurisdictions, and this is where the human dimension comes in and where another level of complexity enters the game. And this is because we have multi-sectoral problems here, because they involve our knowledge that we generate that may actually be used in different governmental but also in different policy sectors. And that calls for a new way of doing research. This calls for a very integrated way. This calls for multidisciplinarity and basically going away from this very disciplinary-driven research of the past and back to what Humboldt actually was advocating. And we take this even further because these issues are multi-level, which means that we have a situation that requires coordinated institutional, but then also policy responses that occur at all kinds of scales, from local scales to transnational scales. And I would like to conclude with this diagram here, where we see different states of the Earth system, and we see time, and we go from quasi-stationary to critical thresholds, and all of that. That has very important consequences with respect to sustainability, with respect to reducing disaster vulnerability, and all these kinds of things. And I would like to ask, in a context of the definition that we gave ourselves of Earth system science, where do we stand? And here we see that looking at these different issues on all timescales is an important aspect of the work. And however, I see today that many of us are more or less operating in this space over here, where we're just looking at possible thresholds without going back into the landscape, without going back into deeper time, without going back into the different proxy indicators that may be very helpful to look at the different magnitudes and the different rates that operate in the Earth system. And I would like to stop at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manfred, for a great talk. We have time for a quick question. If not, in the interest of time, then let's thank Manfred and move on to the next speaker, who's Monica Corte. And it's another invited talk, like all presentations in the sessions. And her presentation is on the spirit of Alexander von Humboldt in modern geomagnetism. I'll try to find an AV guy. Thanks. Move it a little.
It's on the PC, it's not on the Mac.
Ah, it's on the PC.
It's on the PC.
All right, sorry.
Please bear with us while we display a lack of Humboldtian multitasking capabilities here. Yes.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon. Sorry about these technical problems here. So what I want to talk to you about today is about the influence of Alexander von Humboldt on a particular field of science in geomagnetism. And I want to start with a brief side note, because actually I myself benefited from Alexander von Humboldt, one could say, because I wouldn't be standing here if I hadn't been a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation to do what allowed me to do a postdoc abroad that brought me into this international community. So we have heard in the previous talk how Humboldt throughout his life really had this holistic view, and I think that's a very important aspect of Humboldt's thinking and very important influence that he had on science. And that was something that you could see in his big expedition, the important one from 1799 to 1804 to South, Central, and North America, that he did with the French medical doctor and botanist Bonpland. And he did, as many of you will know, observations of all kinds of natural phenomena, of landscapes, of animals, of plants, of people. But he also did a good number of geophysical measurements with a number of different instruments, among them measurements of the geomagnetic field. And in this map, I've just plotted the observations. Of course, they were taken down as handwritten notes by him, but we have the actual measurements documented from the historical archives, and you can see very well how many measurements he did, not only on that first big voyage, but also later on the 1829 voyage to Russia, in the blue points here. Now, these measurements, together with many other historical measurements, are still a very important source of information about the long-term evolution of the magnetic field. But the main results that Humboldt himself got from this expedition, the most important and really new result that he found there was how the Earth's magnetic field intensity varies with latitude and how it decreases from the poles to the equator. He also reports on an observation of a decrease of the magnetic inclination during a strong earthquake in 1799. Well, this is something that we don't see today, but of course we can use tiny electromagnetic signals to study the Earth's lithosphere and properties related to geology or in the lithosphere. So one of the main characteristics of Humboldt was that he had this ability to very meticulously document his observations and describe them in a good way. So, for example, we also have this document how the magnetic needle deviates along the coast of South America and in Europe. Now, Humboldt didn't know what we know today, that every measurement of the magnetic field consists of contributions from the core, the main field, the dominating field of the Earth, but also contributions from magnetized rocks and from electrical currents in the ionosphere and in the magnetosphere outside Earth. And actually, Humboldt observed one of these magnetic storms that are caused by solar influence on the magnetosphere. And up here, I've plotted the measurements that were noted down, of course, just as numbers, but I've plotted them here and compared them with how we have recorded magnetic storms through the decades, through the centuries, for many decades as photographic recording, and of course nowadays as digital recording. And studying these phenomena is still very important because they play an important role in space weather hazards. As I said, Humboldt had this ability to document very well what he noticed. He was not the first one to notice that there was a connection between aurora and the magnetic variation, but we have a very important documentation of his observations at the time. So these measurements were made after he had started to do regular observations in Berlin. And as he lived in different parts of the world for a long time, he lived in Paris. So he also collaborated with French scientists, with international scientists from all over the world, and tried to do observations all over the world because he had noted that we need observations from many places to understand a global phenomenon such as the geomagnetic field. So he recognized and formulated the need to build up a global system of observation stations. He said they have to be similar to the astronomical ones, fixed physical observatories, and where possible on and under the Earth, on isolated tips of rocks and in small islands surrounded by the oceans, because we have large ocean areas, so we need observations from there too. And the brown symbols here indicate where he started to develop his network. So first he started to synchronize the observations in Berlin and Paris and other places like Freiberg and in Marmato in South America. But then he mainly used his Russian journey in 1829 to propose to the Russian Academy of Sciences to establish geomagnetic observatories throughout the large territory of Russia. And he was very successful in doing so. There were several observatories established there at the time. Unfortunately, the centralized collection of global data that he also had in mind was not fully successful first, but that idea was taken up by Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Weber, and they were more successful in 1833 when they established the Göttinger Magnetic Union that really was successful in also bringing together and collecting the observations that were done synchronously in many places around the world. And Humboldt still had an important influence then. For example, he used his reputation, his scientific reputation that he had gained by that time to interest the British Royal Society to contribute to this Göttinger Magnetic Union. So here you can see nowadays Humboldt's vision really has become true. We have a global network of observatories. The symbols that you see here are all the observatories that have been registered with the International Association of Geomagnetism and Aeronomy, with IAGA, over the years. The blue ones are the ones that are in operation today and that build an important backbone of all geomagnetism research as we do it today. Of course, nowadays we also have satellite observations that give us an even better global coverage in a short time. But the long time series of the observatories really are one of the most important sources of data that we have to study the geomagnetic field. And luckily, all through these decades or centuries, also the spirit of free data exchange that Humboldt had in mind has prevailed in geomagnetism. First, the observatories sent around their yearbooks from one to another, and in the digital era now we have world data centers and an association called Intermagnet that collect the data from all the observatories, and it's freely available for scientific purposes so that anyone can use this data to study the geomagnetic field. A prominent example how it's used and an important example that finds wide uses also in interdisciplinary contexts and for practical purposes like navigation is the International Geomagnetic Reference Field, the IGRF, which allows mapping the field all over the surface of the Earth. And this and similar models are also used to get information about how the main part of the field is produced by the geodynamo in the fluid outer core of the Earth. So with that, I'm coming to the first part of my conclusions. So the huge influence of Humboldt on geomagnetism was really to always stress the benefit of collaboration, international, global collaboration that is needed to understand a global phenomenon and to understand our Earth as a whole. And of free global data sharing, which is very much in line with what HU promotes now, the fair data principles, that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Luckily, in geomagnetism, for the observatory data, we always were in the lucky situation that we had the situation with the World Data Centers and the Intermagnet to provide us all with the data that are the backbone to study the geomagnetic field. And not only with these direct observations, but also if we want to understand the geomagnetic field further back in time, we have to rely on experiments that are done in paleomagnetic laboratories all around the world. And also there we have a great spirit of compiling these data into databases. We have great databases that allow us also to use these data to get the global picture of how the geomagnetic field evolved through longer time scales. And the second part of my conclusion is for geomagnetism, as for all other fields of science, this holistic view of trying to really understand how everything works together in the natural Earth system is a very important one. So in particular, for us, we have to understand not only individual sources of the magnetic field, we have to understand the geodynamo process in the outer core, which produces the largest part of the field, but we also have to understand how that is influenced by dynamics in the mantle, by heat flow through the mantle, whether the inner core plays a role for this geodynamo. We have to understand the interactions with the solar irradiation and solar wind, the solar terrestrial interactions on magnetosphere and ionosphere. And we have to understand the induced and remnant magnetization of rocks and geological structures in the crust and the mantle. And why is all of that important? Well, we need the geomagnetic field. It shields us against solar wind and cosmic rays. So it's very important in the modern fields of space weather assessment and space climate. And there are also interesting and more controversial questions whether the geomagnetic field shielding has an influence on climate changes. Of course, it would only play a minor role compared to greenhouse gases, but on geological timescales, it might be one of the minor players that all have an influence on climate. Or if during the time when the shielding of the magnetic field was really weak during magnetic field excursions and reversals, whether that had an influence on life on Earth. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Monica, for a great presentation. We have time for a question, and if you would like to ask a question, please use the microphone because we're recording.
In California and Nevada, there are many places named after Humboldt. Is that true in Europe?
Places, that's a good question. I'm sure
well,
there are.
There's a university, for starters.
That's right. There's a Humboldt University in Berlin. There must be many places. I guess I'm sure there are many schools that are named after him. It's difficult to think of them now, but one of the most important ones for us scientists is the Humboldt Foundation that we heard about in the introduction, because if you're an international scientist and want to come to Germany, think of Alexander from Humboldt.
Yes. And in the thorough research I did for writing the EOS piece with Claudio, Wikipedia lists a lot of the institutions that are named after Humboldt. And there's actually interesting time dependence as to the US leading perhaps the pack and then forgetting about Humboldt is of course also exploited in this book. Okay, well, thanks again, Monica. This was great to hear. And we're going to move on to our next speaker, Professor Anke Friedrich from Munich. And she will be presenting on Humboldt as a pioneer of continent-scale observational tectonics and the new mantle circulation-based perspective to systematic understanding of transient geologic, topographic, and stratigraphic records. And Anke, Claudia, and I were lucky enough to float down the Grand Canyon about as long as it took me to read this sentence. And we were on our way on the 25th birthday of Humboldt, and Anke kindly reminded us and was wearing white on the trip to commemorate Humboldt, which was quite special.
That's right. Thanks for the intro. Should be okay? No. Oh, I have to put volume. Okay. There we go. Yeah, September 14, it was on our day down the Grand Canyon rafting trip. It was spectacular, debating incision and uplift. So this brings us right to the topic. And thanks to the kind question, I would like to reduce my long title to 5 Humboldtian lessons, if you wish, in what I would now call global active tectonics. In fact, one major outstanding problem that we have not yet solved today is that about vertical motion of the Earth's surface over time and on different time scales. And because you kindly asked a question about the Humboldt names, yes, over 900 place names worldwide and probably an increasing number. But the question is, do we know why Nevada has a particular abundance of these place names? And let me give you a brief answer. 2 blocks from here is a street called Fremont or Fremont Street. That's named after the explorer who went on a Western expedition in the northern route here just on the map across Nevada, and to commemorate one of the fantastic methods and techniques that I will be telling you about, that is to draw profiles based on meticulous compilation of data and observations, profiles not just across 100 meters, but across 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers, is what Fremont did as the first one, a topographic profile across this part of the United States. And as you can see, this is significantly farther north than where Alexander von Humboldt has ever set foot. And so the more remarkable it is that names in Nevada have been placed by Fremont after him. So why was Humboldt so successful, and could we repeat what he has done? The first point is already probably not. He was a lucky man, a privatier with sufficient funding to be actually the only one of his time to go on a private expedition with no other obligations. But it was probably paired with a significant amount of passion and perseverance to go through, as you can see, the travel route through the toward the headwaters of the Orinoco. In fact, not the Amazon basin, but it was the Orinoco. And then, of course, down the Andean double chain of volcanoes, and then finally he made it to Mexico City, where he actually spent a year in the archives, or not quite a year, but close to a year. And on his way back, he went to Washington to drop some famous products with President Jefferson. Another reason why Humboldt succeeded in the way he did was his innovative way to apply the measurements that had been restricted to the big ships going across the ocean. They needed to navigate, and they were lost in longitude. So they had just benefited from the invention of a very precise chronometer only decades earlier. And Humboldt figured what's good for the ships is good for Humboldt. So this allowed him to go away from the coast in the deep interiors of the continents, and there he could make hundreds and thousands of measurements, which he meticulously documented in his over 3,500 pages of his travel diary, what has recently been made available online for anyone who's interested in that. Just a brief appreciation. He was not too modest to put out a map of wrong positions, first in 1804, and you can see in the legend that the red cross marks the present-day position. Humboldt's blue stars are his own locations, and you see how significantly he improved the longitudinal measurements. Pick, for example, Mexico City, shown with the red dots. Previously over 500 kilometers of wrong positions, and he had nailed it. And so this was the technique that did allow him to compile volcanoes and linear change thereof, as we will see in a second. A third major technique that he applied was data synthesis. When he was in Mexico City in the archives, he spent months dwelling through existing maps, mainly by the Spanish explorers. And because of his keen observational skills, as you can see here, he picked two symbols in morphology of the Earth's surface, the mesas and the sierras. And if you would find yourself the mesa symbol here in this interior region, that is the Colorado Plateau. And over here, the pointed sierras marks the Rocky Mountains, and over here the Wasatch Front. And so it was maps like this that he used dozens of, but this was probably one of the best ones, the one by Miera y Pacheco, and to compile his famous map of Mexico and the bordering regions. And for our purpose here of interest is the chain, the linear chain of volcanoes or of mountains that he was then first able to see. Previously, this map had been empty, and notice the wide region of the plateau that we can see here that I will show you again later. This finally allowed him to make his interpretation, so again, on his precise measurements of the linear chains of the volcanoes, two of them there are, around Quito, and he figured that if volcanoes group or are aligned, that they must have a common source, and he inferred the source at great depth. And the process in the spirit of the time was upheaval of mountains. And then he went farther north toward Mexico to also look for these double chains of volcanoes. And he found them, but to his big surprise, there was a big plateau in contrast to what he found in the Andes and displayed as these great valleys or crevasses. His idea was that there were many of these volcanoes sticking their back to each other and forming a uniform plateau, from which he also coined the term then backbone mountains of North America. And this is a more detailed depiction of a triplet chain of these volcanoes here in the area of Santa Fe. Here's the second one, and there's the main one. Notice also the more intense slope going all the way to over here, reaching to lower elevations, in contrast to on the Colorado Plateau, just a little bit of a down. So he knew that this was a high plateau. It was very big. He looked for very big causes. This is a famous image that shows the spirit of the time, the deep sources. There's a little bit of a Neptunistic remnant down here by the magmas being layered. But the important part here is the vertical exaggeration, and that he figured would be needed to show, because the interior would keep things flat, but then topography would point out these changes. And so there are active volcanoes and inactive volcanoes, and from this, the most important point we can conclude is that he insisted on geologists, he called them geognosts at the time, to do these repeat measurements. And so as such, he becomes someone of active tectonics. So why was he successful? Because of his sound repeat measurements and data compilation that allowed him to work with precise positions and changing positions. Then his ability to interpret something that he had observed in detail, but he never took it out of context. He always put as global a context as possible. And I would argue some of his interpretations are not necessarily valid today, but those that he made on a truly global scale, I would think that they remain valid today, and the method that he used, urging us to consider true global compilation. So I call this the comparative description of nature, and he would have added old versus new world. In particular, he compared old world, so Europe and Africa, together with South America, and drew many important conclusions. And I highly encourage all of us to go back to his original writings. They're beautifully written, just like his Naturgemälde, his nature painting, is also his text, really worth to read. And probably most famous he is for this particular drawing and for the conclusions that, as Manfred Strecker has shown earlier, that plants and climate change with elevation and with latitude, but rocks do not. He noticed that wherever one would go on this planet, one would find similar assemblages of rocks here and there and there. And he then concluded that it would be most important to study those assemblages to derive new information. And in one place in the Ansichten der Natur, the views of nature, he even pointed out that that would be more important than collecting just another plant. So here is the famous isothermal map of the world. As explained earlier, with the climate zones showing in these east-west striking lines. But here we notice that he even labels this elevated mountain ranges. They go across the trends of the climate zones. And so he inferred that, therefore, the climate zones and the vegetation cover must be younger than the rocks, which, of course, we now know to be true. But if you're the first one pointing this out, he must have been quite excited to notice this. Another fundamental point he made, even before he went on the Asia trip, he had read translated descriptions of Chinese agricultural accountings, and here these vertical lines summarize the vegetation and plants that occur through the climate zones, and he said there is no way that raisins can occur at what was perceived as the highest continuous plateau on Earth. He said this plateau must be interrupted, there must be also linear chains found. So this just shows how he was taking to completion what is an empirical science, but because he made global observations, he was actually able to make prediction, and so I think that's a very modern way to deal. So let's see how we can get to what we're trying to do today. So in the field of tectonics, which is not what Humboldt is known at all for, what are we trying to do? We're trying to connect the interior motion of the mantle here in blue, perhaps down going subduction zones in slab, and in red upwellings that are in some form connected to plate tectonics, the horizontal motion of the plates. And arguably there is some topography. We have not yet been able to connect the topography. Humboldt did observe, he was passionate about observing vertical motion or vertical topography and potential changes from that. And if he would be alive today, perhaps he would enter the room and help us to figure out how to not just compile data in a digital form, pixel by pixel, because with these pixels we lose this context, and we might not be able yet to interpret these observations on a global scale that are so important for the interpretation and for the integration of these models. So I don't want to define Earth system science as a total science, as Manfred Strecker has done before. I want to point out an existing gap, even just within lithospheric dynamics. We have not even been able to connect all the features. We mostly interpret them individually, let's say a metamorphic core complex or a fault system. We take them in isolation. We have not yet put them together. And so, of course, one form would be to ask how would we work, and in Humboldt's way, working is collaborating today. So we could call a workshop in active tectonics, the problem of active uplift, of vertical motion of the Earth is still a problem. Yes, I also think with Manfred Strecker that the scaling, we have more or less figured out its importance. But what is still missing is a map on global scale in the Humboldtian way of vertical motion over time. Yeah, great maps have led to plate tectonic revolutions, but I think if Humboldt walked in the door right now, he would actually help us compile this map, or he would have already done it. And so let me show you why that is so important. Here's one of the more popular cartoons drawn by a community of mantle geodynamicists, and I think they have nicely figured out how the mantle works. But you can see that there is no connection yet to the Earth's surface. A start is that the continents have been vertically exaggerated, but there's no indication of a change of topography over time. And we begin to understand, as Humboldt has also pointed out, that topography does change. So why are we not able to connect this to the mantle motion? That is a driving question for anyone in global active tectonics, and Humboldt would have perhaps just been happy to join us. And so my own modest efforts, let's start on the right-hand side. Here is a vertical exaggeration of a cross-section from the Earth's core mantle boundary to the surface, nicely exaggerated vertically, and as such a plume might be rising in this particular example and perhaps interacting with a plate boundary, such as for the Western United States, we can see that first there's a strong vertical uplift part, but then as a plume head might burst, lateral motion is induced that might lead to a renewed pulse of uplift. Just to say, we're beginning to understand how complex even the surface pattern is, which is something that we typically recognize in our stratigraphic charts, and they're kept quite in isolation from all the other data sets. So here a goal would become to integrate these stratigraphic charts together with mantle convection models. So what you see here in the middle is such a translation of a theoretical mantle plume model, just translated to a stratigraphic chart. And then these colors have been used to color this map that you know otherwise as the standard geological map of North America. And just to show, we are now looking for patterns on the scale. And I think this is quite a Humboldtian scale. Here is the Columbia River Flood Basalt Province, the Basin and Range, and the Colorado Plateau that Humboldt has studied in so much beloved detail, the Rio Grande Rift. We might be postulating two phases of uplift here, but now we're already getting ahead of ourselves into a lovely discussion. I invite all of you to join me in the Humboldtian sense. It's greatly inspiring to read actually his originals, or as another starter, read Andrea Wolf's great book, Incentives of Nature. With this, I would like to close and thank you for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Anke. Leaving us with lots of food for thought here. Do we have a quick question? If not, then in the interest of time, let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. David Pyle of Oxford University, the island that just re-elected Boris Johnson, is going to speak to us on Alexander von Humboldt and the visualization of volcanoes. Like all talks, this one is invited. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to present this in this session. It's a tremendous opportunity. So I'm going to follow on the themes that we've heard before in terms of the reasons why Humboldt made an impact at the time, and give a sense of some of the things that he plumped for in terms of hypotheses at the time, which turned out not to work. But I'm going to start with this Naturgemälde, and I think that the thing that's to really impress on people, if you ever have an opportunity to physically see the printed edition of something like a Naturgemälde, you'll find it a very emotional and inspiring opportunity. The Naturgemälde is a huge wall chart. It's about 3 feet across and 2 feet deep, and I think this just gives a sense of his approach, his encyclopedic approach to kind of gathering information and then representing it on a stage, as it were. And so, as we've heard already, Humboldt's driving idea was that all things that vary with geographical position should be measured, and he wanted to do this in order to investigate the relationships of different factors around the world. And as Susan Fay Cannon pointed out, that in a way the Humboldtian revolution was not about inventing a part of science, but in fact in the way of bringing everything together. So I'm going to illustrate some of this, focusing on the way he illustrated his works and the way that his works were presented to audiences who were not French or German speaking. So when it comes to volcanoes, Humboldt was very impressed by seeing volcanoes in the Americas on his expedition from 1801 in the early 1800s. And he didn't really write at any length about theories around volcanoes until 1823. But in all of these matters, he was really much more interested in collecting information and trying to put it in an order to try to investigate, are there linkages between different volcanic events and tectonic events on large scales, rather than in thinking too deeply about the theory of an individual, how an individual volcano might work. So he had an all-encompassing term. Here he explains that the language that he's using in the early 1800s would apply the term volcanic to all eruptions of subterranean fire, molten matter, to columns of smoke and vapor, and to argillaceous cones emitting mud. So this is his representation of the what are called the air volcanoes of Turbaco, which I think are in Colombia. See, these are mud volcanoes. Again, we've heard something about some of the key influences in Humboldt's approach. So Werner, who really impressed deeply on Humboldt the concept of geognosy, which was about describing the succession of rock sequences. And Humboldt's, I think, impression to start with was that he should be able to recognize geographical variations in these sequences, but of course he didn't. And then Leopold von Buch, who was one of a contemporary of Humboldt's. And von Buch really was the person who collaborated with Humboldt in terms of thinking about processes of volcanic agency or processes of volcanic activity. So von Buch was best known at the time for his hypothesis of craters of elevation, which we'll come to again in a moment, which is that essentially that volcanoes build like blisters and then collapse. And that idea has passed. And in fact, in the paper where von Buch outlined this hypothesis, almost in a footnote at the end of the paper, he pointed out that some of Humboldt's samples that he'd collected from Antizana volcano contained remarkable amounts of albite and hornblende, and so he called these rocks andesite. And this is a term which, of course, we still use in the same sense today. But for those people who came across Humboldt in the English-speaking world, actually the really important person in the matrix was Helen Maria Williams. So Helen Maria Williams was, she shared political views with Humboldt's. They lived in Paris, presumably in the same sort of social circles. And she became his translator. So she wrote or translated his researches, and over 15 years, she translated many of his subsequent editions of his personal narratives. This is a little extract from a poem that Helen Maria Williams wrote in 1823. To the Baron de Humboldt, on his bringing me some flowers in March, soothed, I receive the flowers you bring, whose charm anticipates the spring, whose tints in vernal freshness vie with plants beneath an austral sky. So Helen Maria Williams played a really important role in capturing the poetry of Humboldt's writings. He wrote mainly in French at that time. And it's clear that they interacted very closely so that Humboldt approved the spirit and sense of the translations. Just as an aside, Helen Maria Williams was the subject of William Wordsworth's very first poem in 1787, titled something like "On Seeing Helen Maria Williams Burst into Tears at a Sad Story." So this is the front page of one of the many volumes of Humboldt's researches. And we see this epic view of Cotopaxi. And in the introduction to the narratives, Helen Maria Williams focuses on the features that distinguished Humboldt at that time. And that was that previous explorers or scientists or natural historians had scaled the lofty Andes, but it was only to measure their height and make astronomical observations, and none of them had the peculiar manner that Humboldt had of seeing nature in all of her overwhelming greatness. So it's his capacity to bring together his many precise and careful observations that distinguishes him from his contemporaries. So this is Cotopaxi, and the thing that I marvel at actually is the way that he has a capacity to make these very careful field observations, and his field sketches look somewhat sparse. So I think there's a representation of a field sketch in the lower part of this image. But in turning it into the printed image, working presumably with lithographers and graphic artists, he encapsulates the spirit of the volcano without worrying about too much of the precise detail. So he represents on the volcano the features that he wants to represent: the snow line, the change in the nature of the overall topography of the volcanic system, the gradients, the changes in the material as you go up the volcano. So this is his representation of Chimborazo. This is from his atlas in 1815. And here he's playing around with some of the techniques that he'd used in the Naturgemälde, which is to try and represent multiple pieces of information in the same place. So on the, out on the one side we have the sequence of plants that he finds up the volcano. There's the representation of the snow line on the topography of the volcano, and then a representation, very careful representation of the physical topography of the volcano as you go away from that system. And then on the sidebars, there are references to equivalent heights of mountains in other places and the heights to which people had traveled in balloons and so on. Yes, so as he says here, observations are not really interesting except when we can dispose their results in such a manner as to lead to general ideas. So it's just, I think it's very hard now to appreciate quite how revolutionary his capacity of distilling information into a digestible and reproducible form was. So here's a print of Chimborazo. This is now printed 30 years later after his original version. And so this was such an epic, or these images were so epically significant, and they were still produced at a time when printing was rather an expensive activity. And this is now a representation of Chimborazo in the first version of a patent oil color printing. So it's in a form which can now be mass produced. So just focusing on the Naturgemälde, what he's done very cleverly here is to take his physical representation of Chimborazo, his physical representation of Cotopaxi, and he's put them together in a way that's geographically impossible, because they don't sit like that. But it's all in an attempt to try and capture the spatial variations going on, put it into some order and some sense. And his descriptions, of course, of his ascent, or attempted ascent of Chimborazo is extraordinary, because they reach an elevation where the people are starting to suffer, blood's coming out of their eyes and their noses, and eventually they get to a crevasse and they can't go any further. And while they were climbing this mountain, reaching the highest point reached by humans at that point of time, they were carrying all these measuring instruments with them. They were still making the measurements of pressure as they were going up. So here's some extracts around. So one of the volcanoes he went to visit on his tour across Mexico was a location called Jorullo. And this is a volcano which is out on the high Mexican plains. And he spent about 2 or 3 days there. That's all. So as he was traveling across Mexico, he was making these topographic, these very precise measurements. We see 2 pages out of the American notebooks, which, as a previous speaker pointed out, have been digitized and are readily accessible. So on your left-hand side, you can see in the middle of the diagram, there's a sort of sketch of the volcano, and then there are all the measurements below it, which allowed him to reconstruct the topography and to draw the volcano in plan view. And then on the other side, he's focused in on a detail, a little steaming vent, which he found of which he found a number in the ground, and he called these hornitos, little ovens. It's a really quite captivating little image of this volcano. So he's talked to a couple of people who still had recollections of how the volcano had erupted. The eruption had been in 1759, and he was now traveling across in 1802, so some years later. But he developed very strongly developed the idea that this volcano had emerged out of the ground during a course of an eruption. Here's another one of his very careful topographic representations of the elevation changes across the crater of the volcano. So this image, the image that he eventually published in a number of different places, this is the volcanic field of Jorullo. So you see the large cones of Jorullo in the background, and in the foreground you can see the detail of those hornitos, this great plain of presumably lava, which had maybe it run over some groundwater and triggered these little secondary vents or something. And this image really encapsulated the story of Jorullo volcano. And back in the UK, some geoscientists simply didn't believe the interpretation, but they were quite captivated by the image. And other geoscientists, or other scientists writing on volcanoes, notably Charles Daubeny, who was a professor of chemistry, found this really a compelling hypothesis. And so the story of Jorullo became very tightly bound up with von Buch's understanding of the development of volcanoes as craters of elevation, and in Humboldt's perception, Jorullo encapsulated that idea. So Charles Daubeny was one British scientist who very much influenced by Humboldt's approach to precise observation and then trying to represent large amounts of data in different ways. So in 1826, Daubeny wrote a treatise on volcanoes. In 1827, he published, again, a very large tableau representing the shapes and sizes of volcanoes around the world, and that's 1827. And one of the little toys that Daubeny played with in his textbook was something called the geological thermometer. And so he has a temperature scale that goes from 100 at the top down to 0 at the bottom. And on this scale, he represents people's understanding of what it is that drives volcanism. So at 0, you find Werner, who's the Neptunist, and at 100, you find Whiston, who believed the Earth had started off entirely molten. And then around 60 to 70, there are the people who work on active volcanoes, and so who recognize volcanoes as something different from the Plutonists and Neptunists' argument. Another individual who was very strongly influenced by the way that Humboldt represented three-dimensional data was an extraordinary man called Franz Junghun, who mapped the volcanoes of Java in the 1840s. And his sketches are just extraordinary. He has these architectural representations of topography. It's very idealized, but obviously vertically exaggerated. And then on the other side, this thing, it looks like a biological organ. It's actually his representation of the plan view of Slamet volcano, imagined as if he were viewing it from above, which today, again, it's very hard to imagine. Of course, you know what a volcano looks like from above, but in those days, the only way you'd have known it was if you'd got in a hot air balloon. So again, some of Junghun's, and Junghun clearly corresponded with Humboldt, and by the time that Humboldt wrote Cosmos, Junghun was mentioned in there. So just to close up, really, here's a snippet of a poem written by Oliver Wendell Holmes on the occasion of Humboldt's birthday in 1869. He read the record of the planet's page by Etna's glare and Cotopaxi's torch. And then beneath that we have Edwin Church's Cotopaxi. So again, huge landscape-style paintings, very much influenced by Humboldt's approach. So I want to say thank you, huge thank you to the many curators and archivists I've worked with over the last decade. And thanks again for this opportunity to reinvestigate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a fantastic presentation highlighting the importance of imagery in a beautiful way. We have time for a quick question. If you can speak up, maybe I can repeat the question.
A quick question concerning magnetism and the role of ice, snow, and water. There are some comments on that in Ansichten der Natur
I'll have to go back and have a look at that, actually. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I think it's, so I think I've only read the first version of that essay, which was published in about 1823 in translation. And I'll certainly go and have a look at that. Yeah, thank you.
Another quick question.
Is there evidence that Humboldt's work influenced or shaped landscape painting in the 19th century?
So certainly, if you read the art historian's perspective, there's a very clear linkage. Humboldt was an influencer of artists on a number of different scales. But I think Frederick Church is recognized as the person who was most directly excited by Humboldt's work. So I think Church actually, having read Humboldt's work, Church went to Cotopaxi on a number of different occasions and painted Cotopaxi over the course of about a decade. So there are representations of Cotopaxi, but set in a Humboldtian landscape, as it were, where the detail of the landscape and of the plants within that landscape are trying to be faithful to Humboldt's worldview, as well as putting, kind of more of a naturalistic image of a volcano in its setting. And I think there are also, I forgot the name now. Anyway, but there were certainly some British artists who were also inspired. Yeah.
Great, let's thank Dr. Paul again. And we're moving on to the next presentation by Carina Horn from the University of Amsterdam on Alexander von Humboldt, from the beginnings of biogeography to advancements in the 21st century.
This one. To go up and down, and then you can use this mouse. Yeah, and for the switch, you use the mouse.
Okay, switch. Okay, I want to thank first of all the conveners for putting this fantastic session together, and also to you all for coming. So you've seen already quite a few aspects of Humboldt, the polymath, and his influence on science. And I would like to move on now to talk about Humboldt's tremendous importance for the field of biogeography, and also how he was basically the founder of this field, but also how his way of thinking is still very important for the developments in the field today. And I would like to argue that it's very important to bridge, in the way he did, the sciences, biology and geology. So Humboldt was part of the stream of scientists of the 18th and 19th century he set this agenda, in fact, himself, of having this holistic vision of nature. But he was a product of his time in a way, because in the 18th century, many expeditions were geared at collecting and describing. And there was a transition. Maybe the first who set this on was Kant, the philosopher, is that you had to see organisms in a geographic space and not just collect and see them as items to put in a museum. And so there was a change from collecting, classifying, to understand the process, the geography, the context. And this is basically what Humboldt had as mission that he set to himself, is in a new way, collect data and very systematically be skeptical and use the latest tools. And this is what then led to his work in South America, led to this, basically the founding of the field of biogeography. And he was not alone, the only founder. He set the agenda for plant geography. But of course, Alfred Wallace Russell is also the co-founder by doing this setting the animal geography. And at the same time, biogeography is a bridging field. It studies the distribution of species in a geographical sense, but also in the sense of time. And in the same way, ecology is part of this, in the interaction of biota in the abiotic surroundings. Of course, you've seen this picture already. This is Humboldt at the foot of the Chimborazo collecting, and this was their transformative work, really, of Humboldt and Bonpland, who went out to South America to collect in the first place, but also do all these measurements. And they collected over 6,000 specimens. They brought back about 3,000 were new species. And so the work as a botanist was crucial. Of course, he was not the first one working in South America. There were many scientists there already. The Spanish had sent a mission, the Royal Mission for Botanical Collections, headed by Mutis. And there was also Calda, so there was already science being done in South America, but this new way of measuring the physical variables and collecting was really the new thing that Humboldt brought, and was really the transformative way of working. So most known, of course, is the recognition of the elevational gradient, where plants are organized along this elevational gradient, along basically gradient of humidity, temperature, pressure. And so in these illustrations, such as this, it's well indicated how these plant groups are organized. You have the montane forest, paramo, snowline, and of course the Naturgemalde epitomizes this. And this fantastic way of showing the variables, but also this combination in this artistic way of showing a distribution of plants in zones was synthesized in his essay on the geography of plants. And but how does the biogeography, how did it develop? How's the relation with geology? Of course, we heard already about the founders of the field of geology, Lyell, but first of all Hutton. The theory of Earth was just emerging. So when Humboldt started doing his science, it was not yet a fully developed field. He was very conscious, of course, as geologist, of the importance of geology, but it was not yet incorporated in the aspect of time and how biota evolved over time and how this relation with geology was. So Humboldt writes his essay on plant geography at the beginning of the 19th century. And then it's also the time when the field of geology started developing further with Lyell, writing the principle of geology, the realization of the processes that we see today are also the ones that created the geological record. And of course, all these works influenced Darwin. Darwin read Humboldt's work and was very inspired by this. And later on, Wallace, who was the co-proposer of the theory of evolution, already used much more this geological knowledge in advancing the field of biogeography and wrote the geographical distribution of animals. Again, this influence of geology on biogeography, maybe first of all by Wegener, who recognized the distribution of plants had a relation with the way the continents were distributed and would have fit together. But it was only in the 60s, of course, that this mechanism was proven. And this was fundamental for rewriting then the plant geography, such as Peter Raven and Axel Roth did in their 1974 work, where they saw plant distribution in the context of plate tectonics. And then, of course, a later step, a very important transformation, is the molecular evolution, when molecular phylogenies reorganized basically the way what was known about plants. And this community is really needy of understanding well the relation between distribution of the plants and the geological background to have properly informed biogeographic models. So what can we do now? What's the current situation if we build on from Humboldt? For instance, how can we understand the relation between mountain building, climate, and biodiversity? And so to assess this, we did a study together with a group of colleagues, which was looking at the biodiversity distribution, richness, species richness, and then in relation with physical parameters. Because mountains are a small part of the world, a tenth of the Earth's surface, but they hold about a quarter of the species diversity. So it was not for nothing that Humboldt was so interested in documenting the mountains, understanding the elevational gradient. And so it becomes apparent from these comparative studies that, climate is very important, but certainly also the relief and the environmental heterogeneity is, plays a key role in understanding distribution of mountain diversity. In the spirit of Humboldt, this year we had a special issue in the Journal of Biogeography. Of course, the journal celebrated by calling anybody who was working in this discipline to contribute and celebrate. And so one of the papers highlights like how can we understand mountain biodiversity in the context of geology. And so the concept is that by understanding mountain uplift, you get species colonize, pre-adapted taxa colonize these new surfaces. And so by understanding mountain building, you can also understand when there is opportunity for species to colonize, to occupy these new niches. Not only do you need mountain building, also the role of climate is very important, especially the climate variations, which bring in changes of erosion and all affect the, for instance, connectivity between mountain regions. So you have double whammy of different processes in mountains acting up each other to create this biodiversity. So how the biodiversity in basically Humboldt's mountains could form. So if we go to the northern Andes, what can we say? When did the elevational gradient form? So show you here a map that makes use of the exhumation rates, thermochronology, to understand when can we expect these gradients. And this sort of information is extremely important for biogeographic models to understand immigration and speciation. For instance, how did the Andean biogeographic regions form? So just last year there was a paper in the PNAS showing how these biogeographic regions based on bird diversity are distributed across the mountains. And when you look at it with a geological eye, there's a very clear relation between these different regions and the actual species diversity. So it's basically very important to provide this kind of knowledge for the biogeographic community to understand what the how this process took place, and also, for instance, when did the altitudes in the current mountains when were they formed? So the models of mountain building are very crucial to inform this. Not only information from thermochronology, exhumation, also paleontological data, very important to integrate with the in these models. Joining paleontological data with molecular records give new insight on how migration, colonization of the mountains took place. So here's an example of the northern Andes, where taxa from the north, in this case boreal taxa, were able to colonize the incipient mountains and subsequently diversified in this altitudinal gradient that was formed especially in the late Neogene due to uplifting of the Andes. Another very nice example, and then one that's very much used in the biogeographic literature, is that of colonization from austral taxa, again pre-adapted taxa from temperate region, migrate into the northern Andes and use this, take advantage of this elevational gradient that has been formed by uplift. And so this kind of information where there's bridging of geology, biology, These are very, very much needed, and that's where the geological data really can play a very important role. Yeah, so for instance, in this case, the Campanulaceae, this austral taxa, they colonized the slopes, and you can see here that from about 5 million years onwards, there was a peak in diversification. I don't want to scare you with these trees, but it's just to indicate like how fast the diversification was. These branches of the tree show that, and that this is related to uplift, and that basically in this case temperature played no role. Also, another group in which it's very important to consider the elevational gradient and wonder how this affected the group is the grasses. You can see here a figure is playing with the Naturgemalde and showing that also the grasses are organized according to this elevational gradient. And you have at the top the C3 grasses, one that you see around here as well, type of pampa grass. Those are high altitude grasses, and then you have a gradient along the slopes. How did this form? Again, by looking both at the geological record, at the process of uplift, paleogeography. This helps us understand how the grasses evolved across time, taking advantage of the environments, such as in this case, the aquatic system in the lowlands in the Miocene, and then subsequently uplift in the mountains. Megafen formation would have promoted also further diversity and increase of this group. So I would like to make that point that to understand the biogeography and biodiversity in South America, we have to see this in a geobiological context to understand uplift, know past altitudes and when they were formed. And by bridging these fields, geology and biology, we can come to a better understanding of how this formed. New frontiers in the research in the Amazon region, I just want to highlight this, is to understand past biodiversity in the modern context, this trans-Amazon drilling, which will happen in the next year, and where we hope to find out much more about past diversity. And I'm sure that Humboldt would have been thrilled by these kind of possibilities, the toolkit of the modern geology, the possibilities to understand past diversity. So basically what I want to say is that what we need to improve biogeographic modeling, accurate, complete geological data, and also for people being willing to cross these bridges. And I like to use this image of C.P. Snow from the famous lecture of 1959, where he lamented that there was this big gulf, this misunderstanding between the sciences and the literary intellectuals. And so maybe the bridge is not that big, the gap is not so big between biology and geology, but it's definitely more should be done to cross this bridge. And yeah, so accurate and up-to-date geological data in biogeographic models can lead to a better understanding of natural history and also more effective conservation of global biodiversity. Not only that, it's not a one-way street, it goes two ways, because as we've seen in this conference, it's also very important to understand plant distribution, plant composition, to understand geological processes. So both communities would really benefit from such interaction. And I think I would like to still highlight the special issue for papers on linking the communities in the Humboldtian spirit, which you can find in the Journal of Biogeography. And also a large group of authors have worked together to get this work out on mountains, climate, and biodiversity, where basically the two fields are used to come to this better understanding. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Horn. We're running a little bit behind time. I don't see any urgent questions, so let us move on. Thank you. And the next presentation is by Professor Sean Willett of the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule in Zurich. Along similar lines of topics, the title of the presentation is Landscape Evolution and Biodiversity in the Age of Plate Tectonics.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the organizers for this really interesting session, and especially the speakers who've come before who've really given us a nice history of Humboldt's work, his context in the historical world. I'd like to take a little different approach. I'd like to just take one of his ideas and try to look at how that's really influenced the way the modern research field is still to this day really dominated by this idea. And this is Humboldt's contention, really, that abiotic processes shape biological species distributions. And this is encapsulated in many of his classic works, including the Naturgemälde, but also this view of the Himalaya, in which he really documented extremely well how the distribution of plants, that is the distribution of all species really, are really dominated by these abiotic factors, primarily temperature and water availability, precipitation, even down to the microclimate level. And this is really, one of his major, probably his major contribution to the, he's really regarded as the father of the field of ecology, which is really connecting the abiotic and the biotic, even though we know he was really a geologist at heart. But these ideas are really very present even right into the modern, these ideas of habitat, of ranges of species. Today we do talk more about things like biodiversity, but we're really talking about ranges of species and how those overlap in order to create that biodiversity. And we see this, of course, through the zonation across mountains and the zonation across latitude and the concept of isotherms. Now, how has this concept held up over the last 200 years? I think it's held up extremely well. We see that, in fact, these ideas of habitat and of zonation are still present. This is, in fact, the paper that was mentioned by Karina in the last paper, showing in the last talk, talking about how climate and topography, elevation, and latitude have really influenced both plant and animal biodiversity. These are shown down below. From separate papers, but these sorts of correlations then between the abiotic and biotic are in fact going right up to 2018, 2019. This is the modern view of how we deal with these relationships are still present. And this is still the Humboldtian concept, that it is these measurable abiotic parameters like temperature that in fact are well correlatable with either ranges, direct ranges, or total biodiversity of a system. And these are just showing some of these sorts of results from these very modern papers. What I think is sort of interesting, though, is that it doesn't always hold up, in the sense that there are clearly more complex dimensions to this problem. This, for example, is now showing a residual of the biodiversity after being regressed against temperature, precipitation, and climate parameters. So this is showing us sort of what's left after these correlations have already explained as much of the variance in the data as possible. And what's interesting, of course, is there's still patterns here, right? We don't explain everything simply by simple correlations with these sorts of parameters. There is still something here missing. There's still another factor. And I would argue that the one thing that Humboldt actually hinted at, but didn't, of course, understand, was what we know today about plate tectonics, about the dynamics of plate motion, of the transience of the land surface, but also the transience of the climate. And that transience might be spatial or it might be temporal, but for the life living on any piece of rock, it doesn't really matter very much. What we have today is, of course, pictures like this, where continents move, the climatic parameters are changing with time, and it's probably something in that temporal evolution, transience, that in fact is explaining much of what is missed by the simple sorts of latitudinal isogrades or isotherms that a Humboldt would show. But this is really now the modern, right? This is actually the frontier of research in these fields today, is really trying to take this Humboldtian concept of a network and bring it into the modern research field, modern research realm. And we're seeing this now. We're seeing this really in the modern, as we try to bring together these rather diverse fields, such as geodynamics, or climate modeling. And we try to bring those together with things like landscape evolution models, finally, in order to define habitat, and then look at processes such as speciation across those landforms. And in fact, some of these are all now systems that we're able to model, and we're able to look at this. And again, in the modern research fields, we're trying to investigate things like this. On the left is sort of a modern geodynamic landscape evolution model. That's what's now defining the habitat parameters. We would like to be able to do things like predict speciation, evolution, extinction, dispersal of species across this. And we can now start to do that by using things like grid-based numerical models that are able to try to bring in the rules that come from modern biogeography and from modern evolution in order to try to look at how things might evolve across that. This, for example, is the sort of model that my colleagues at ETH are now working with. This is work primarily of Loic Pellissier, but there's quite a group of people working with things like this, in which we can take what are really a grid of the Earth's surface, which is represented here, and look at processes such as speciation that may occur through allopatric processes of isolation of habitat by what are either landscape changes or tectonic changes. We can look at new species that develop. We can watch as those may disperse across the landscape, as down here, or even go extinct if they become isolated and that habitat changes. So ultimately, it must be clear that the net biodiversity that we see has to be a function of not only the parameters of the Earth, the abiotic parameters of the Earth today, but also their history and how these have changed across time. And it's this dynamic component that we've really only in the last couple of decades been able to say something about. So I wanted to give a couple of quick examples of where we think this has happened. The Andes, of course, is a very popular place to look at, and Karina Horn gave us some examples of some of the evolution that's occurred there. The reason being that's a big red spot on this sort of map that's one of the most diverse spots in the world, in part because it's sitting in the tropics and yet has a huge elevation gradient that gives us the full range of climatic zones in one particular place. But again, we can start to think about how that's evolved in time, and I'm not going to talk about the data side of this, but of course that does exist, but here's an example of this sort of a model where we can start to look at how species evolve. When we take, on the left is sort of the landscape, the evolution, that we can put together from tectonic models, and on the right then trying to look at how the species evolve across this sort of a landscape. And this is again one of these seed-based models that includes both speciation, evolution. It has the evolution of the habitat and then the dispersal of the species. And what we can see is, of course, as the modern elevation grows and we have the climate gradients, we have an increase in the biodiversity. But what's also interesting for the Andes is because they are a north-south running range, as again a Humboldtian observation, it is the ability to migrate north-south along an isotherm that gives the ability, for example, as the Earth cools through the Cenozoic, for species to move from the southern Andes up into the northern Andes. So this sort of a large gradient is very important for the final biodiversity, but also this ability to migrate along isotherms or along lines of common habitat. Another interesting example I'd like to show quickly is rift escarpments. These are standing out in this map of the biodiversity. As I should point out, is the vascular plant biodiversity of the world, but these zones of what are old passive margins we refer to as rift escarpments can stand out. This is Brazil, Madagascar, and India, for example, again, as regions of relatively high biodiversity. This is sort of interesting from a plate tectonic landscape evolution concept, because these are not tectonically active areas, nor are they high mountain ranges, but they are regions of very high landscape dynamics. These form during rifting, but then these escarpments that form on the edge of the continents tend to migrate inland. So we see in the model on the right, that's a landscape evolution model of that process. And so it leads to this is a case where we have dynamics in the landscape that's not necessarily tectonic, it's not necessarily climatic, but it is leading to some rather specific conditions. In particular, we do have a topographic gradient, and one that remains relatively sharp for a long period of time, more than 100 million years in many cases. But we also have things like large captures of rivers from a high plateau down into a low coastal area. which results in changes of habitat connectivity as this whole system kind of migrates across the landscape. So somehow these sorts of landscape dynamics and transients are leading then to data that look like this, where we see these endemic species richness that is very high along these zones of landscape dynamics along the coasts of in this case, India, Madagascar, and Brazil. One last example I'd like to show is what we call a tectonic escape zone. This is the area of southwest China. Again, this stands out in this map of biodiversity as a big red zone. In fact, this is the most biodiverse zone outside of the tropics. So again, it's not likely to be purely a climatic effect. It's not likely to be a purely topographic effect, as it sits right next to the Himalaya, and yet is actually has a higher degree of biodiversity, and in particular a higher degree of endemism than the high Himalaya, which is right next to it. But this is this region over here in the corner where India is moving north into Asia. But this part of the mountainous Tibetan region is actually expelled out to the east and the south in response to this tectonic motion. And the result is an area where the landforms are highly deformed. In red here are the drainage basins of three of the biggest rivers in the world, the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Salween. Those don't look like normal sorts of drainage basins. They're highly deformed, presumably by this tectonics, to give this rather odd shape as these rivers all sort of move around the indenting Indian plate and high Himalaya. And what this is, sort of implies is that there's been this history of very large captures of rivers into each other to sort of reform the network. And this is, for example, one model of those rivers sort of coming together from left to right to form the modern river network. And again, this implies rather large landscape dynamics changes across time. Again, a landscape evolution model showing a river network that was flowing from north to south as it's being deformed, in this case by something like the India collision. And all the blues and reds are the erosion rates in response to that sort of a deformation. So what we're seeing is a heterogeneity. We're seeing an increase in variation in both the landscape and also erosion rates and presumably other surface processes, all in response to this tectonic process that's deforming the upper surface. Now, when things, there are very specific and individual examples of this sort of thing. When we have large river captures, that certainly changes the landscape. This is the first bend of the Yangtze, which is this river down here in the corner. This is taken right at this corner here. This is not the typical sort of structure for a river, and usually the way we interpret this is this represents a river capture where the river used to flow directly to the south, but has then been captured and now flows to the north. So we have a brand new river that's now flowing directly north, and these new rivers tend to be relatively unstable, so they do look like this, for example. They tend to incise very rapidly, they're very steep, and this then becomes a new way of increasing barriers to dispersal of species and thus separating habitat, leading to speciation. So the idea is that these are, in fact, these sorts of transients in the landscape, things like river captures, strain, tend to increase the variance of the geodiversity, which is then leading to enhanced biodiversity. But again, it's still this complex interplay between the abiotic, the tectonic landscape processes, and the biotic processes that gives us things like, again, here is an example of the richness, the diversity of rhododendrons that are, or many other plants that we could look at across exactly this region where we have these tectonic processes taking place. So to wrap it up, I'd just like to say that the Humboldt's view of the world as sort of a complex dynamic system, in fact, fits extremely well with the modern view of the world, with things like Manfred mentioned, Earth system science, where this is a very popular concept today, far more than it was 20 years ago even, that we are dealing with very complex coupled dynamic systems, and that as we understand these better, and particularly the temporal components of things like climate change and geodynamics, we're able to better understand not just the variance in biodiversity, but how this has evolved over time. And I would argue that this, in fact, is really a modern frontier of research at the moment, and we'll expect to see much more in the future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sean. Great presentation. We do have time for questions. I guess I have one. What's happening in Northeast and South America in your models where you have this drop in biodiversity in a large region? So this black hole arising late. You have a lot of biodiversity along the topography, but then everything goes black.
I didn't notice the black hole. This is work that Linian Boschman is doing in the group. She gave a poster yesterday on this. These are pretty early models, so I think they're not yet tuned or calibrated to these things. So if Colombia is your favorite place and it looks like a black hole, we'll keep working on it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let's thank Sean again. And we're moving on to the last presentation of the session by Professor Julia Clark of the University of Texas at Austin. And she will be speaking to us on seeing the whole and its parts, the synthetic signs of Alexander von Humboldt, and new questions at the interfaces of tectonics and life. Julia.
Hi, thank you for your patience and hanging out through the end of the day, and thank you to the conveners for making all of this fun happen. What I'm going to start with is, what I'm going to present today is kind of first a sort of leitmotif about giant birds and tectonics, and then I'm going to talk about results from a new translation we've done of one of Humboldt's essays, which was actually basically uncited in the subsequent 200 years since he did his work. And I want to acknowledge the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, which funded my stay in Germany. Am I too far from the mic? Stay in Germany that allowed us to do this new translation. So with that, let's take our final look at the Naturgemälde for the day. And what I want you to do is think about this diagram in a different way. Of course, we can zoom in and we can see the distributions of plants and over this mountain range. And as we've seen in all of these different models, this fabulous work that's already been presented today, we can think about the dynamic change that is made for these distributions. But there's another aspect to it, because of course these things are dynamic, they're changing, and our knowledge of them is only informed by direct observation. So like actual measurements in the field of what and where we see organisms on the surface of the Earth. So, of course, we also have these diagrams, this integration that you've already seen of sort of tectonics, of climate, and of life. And we can update that, and this is just one example of kind of looking at trying to synthesize the tectonic drivers and the climate drivers of extant biodiversity. And the work by Seed is really exciting in that respect. I want to point out another aspect of this that was always part of the dialogue, particularly in the 19th century and the 20th century, which was deep tectonic events and their effects on shaping where and how life is today. And so you can see I've just put a couple of dates on there. This is estimates of like similarity and dissimilarity in the organisms that cover the globe, and then these so-called identified transition zones. And you'll notice if you think about plate tectonics on a deep scale that a lot of these transition zones are recent. And one of the ones that I find in terms of new questions or open questions in tectonics and life is how exchange between Africa and Asia has really shaped the faunas and floras in both places. So I think that is one of these kind of open questions right now. But I want to turn to kind of the textbook case of sort of tectonics and life at a deep scale. So we're not talking about kind of very recent mountain building dynamics, but deep tectonic connections among continents. And this was this classic example. I feel like most of us got this in a textbook, which was giant birds, and they're rafting around on the breakup of Gondwana and becoming widely distributed across various southern continents. And we've really experienced kind of a paradigm shift as we've, through molecular sequence data, begun to track and discern the phylogenetic relationships between flighted and unflighted members of these giant bird groups. And in fact, this seems to be much more driven by late Neogene or late Cenozoic dynamics than it is one that is reflective of Gondwanan dispersal. And so this is a kind of recent one molecular phylogeny, and it shows the diversification of all of these now giant flightless birds being essentially younger than the late Cretaceous, far too young to have been driven by Gondwanan breakup. And that's similarly true for a lot of groups that are major mammal clades that are originating in Africa and then becoming very important on a global scale. So we are talking kind of a vertebrate focus here. And this is just a recent study that we did, and essentially this assumption that these big birds had been big and birdy and flightless for a long, long period of time had actually influenced how we looked at actual data on body size increases. And so we recently proposed that, in fact, body size increases in these bird groups that are distributed, many of them on islands or on things that were islands like South America for millions of years, were actually driven by late Neogene cooling. And that's kind of a paradigm shift in sort of looking at how you explain these things. So for example, we also looked at the effect of being on an island versus a continent, which did not explain the body size increases that we saw. So I think it's really important to kind of look at our assumptions of how, like the deep history of biodiversity, what major groups of organisms are on continents, and kind of the origin of those exchanges among different major tectonic land masses. So I want you to look at this picture now really for the last time. I'm not lying. And this picture, I want you to think of it in another way, which is as a dissection. So in this picture, we have a cross-section through the mountain, and you're exposed to all the names of the distribution of plants in this sphere. And in fact, the notions behind Naturgemälde, or the idea of this interconnectedness of all life in Humboldt's thinking, was not just one of kind of abiotic or geologic kind of processes and biotic distributions, but it was actually extended to even parts of organisms. So this is one of our new translation of this essay. Every organic creature, yes, even every part of an organic creature interacts with the rest of nature. And so kind of with this, let's look a little bit at other aspects of Humboldt's voyage. So his voyage was not just one that was in volcanoes and plant distributions and recording the species that he saw, but it was an acoustic voyage. Okay, well that's a little loud, so I'll just tell you what is going to happen now. I have no idea how that is so loud, but I was going to play the sounds of various organisms. And in fact, these organisms, which were the ones that kind of drew Humboldt's fascination. And so the ones that were being played were the crocodile's roar, right? The roar, or that loud sound that you just heard, is actually made with the closed mouth in crocodilians, howler monkeys, different species of birds that drew his attention. And if you, speaking to that, and literally speaking to that, Humboldt was fascinated with the idea that we make sense of an acoustic landscape by our sense-making apparatus as humans is in kind of relative to our own experience. So if in fact a lot of these things he heard in this very foreign landscape, right? The sky denotes rain, I mean, his wonderful poetry, but he's saying that this world is familiar. It's acoustically familiar. And this was something that he developed in his series of essays on natural history. And in fact, if we kind of go into this work, these are all kind of pictures from his illustrated volume that was about biology and comparative anatomy, which was what he called it. And most of it is not actually comparative. So one of the two essays that really delve into process and to kind of a broader theoretical frame are his essay on the electric eel. You might be like, I'm at AGU, why am I hearing about an electric eel? Or maybe you just want a little leitmotif at the end of your day. Famously, Humboldt did this drawing himself, so most of the drawings you've seen today were not done by Humboldt. We saw the sketch of the volcano, but he drew this electric eel himself. It looks kind of primitive. That's reflective of his drawing abilities relative to those of Bonpland. But in the lower left, you see a famous experiment they did by driving these horses into a stream to lure out the electric eels so they could observe how they were electrifying the horses, the poor horses in this experiment, and then also study how these electrical phenomena were produced. The only other essay, these are drawings that were done by Humboldt. So in fact, Bonpland did not do these illustrations. He says explicitly that Bonpland was the better dissector. So he made the drawings. And they're all a bit primitive, but what he's comparing is the vocal organs of birds, primates, and crocodiles, which is really striking in its modernity in some ways when we think about what we know about learned vocalizations, and vocalization in different groups of animals. So I want to show this. This is a poor picture I took in the Goethe Museum, but Humboldt was heavily influenced by Goethe's thought around putting things in juxtaposition and coming up with new patterns or new relationships among those things. This is a picture that was sent to Goethe, and it illustrates comparisons of the heights of the mountains in the Old World and the New World and their vegetation. But also in Goethe's collection, and also a very important and influencing principle on Humboldt, was the concept of the archetype or the unity of form. And I think this could also extend to some of his work in the geological, in the sphere of looking and comparing mountains, comparing different distributions, this idea of unity among difference. And so what's notable in these skeletons is that the birds look kind of weirdly human-like, and that is actually interesting because he was exchanging a lot of written correspondence and data with his brother Wilhelm von Humboldt, who is famous for his theory of languages. And so Humboldt talks about giving all of his work on language to his brother. But I want you to look here at some kind of really forward-thinking notions. Here, man is an animal. And man is an animal that is uniquely characterized by uniting thoughts with acoustic production. So thinking back to this journey and this voyage as one that is also taking place in an acoustic space. When we look at complex vocal communication today, something that I work on in its evolution, what's really striking is that of all these pictures that are shown, all of them vocalize using one vocal organ, the larynx, which is what I'm using to speak to you today. You get that idea. And then except for the bird that's in the lower right-hand side, so they evolve a completely novel way of producing sound that's not seen in any other vertebrate. What birds also show is complex vocal communication, and they also evolve the capacity of learned song. So nowadays, in just the last 10 to 20 years, we're very interested in looking at these cases of the acquisition of language, the acquisition of changes in the vocal organ and changes in song learning that are occurring independently. And it was Humboldt who brought these things into juxtaposition in looking at birds and their closest relative, crocodiles, and apes back in the 18th century. And in fact, he was totally ignored. This is uncited even by his German contemporaries. So it's really quite striking. This is a quote from his brother, who is widely cited in looking at the relationship among language. And he's uniting the structure that produces sound with the thoughts behind the sound making itself. And he's linking this to our notion of human identity. And I think this is why Alexander von Humboldt's only essay that is truly comparative anatomy is about vocal organs and how he's interested in this acoustic landscape in which his voyage is taking place. And so just to close today, this is the kind of toolkit I'm just showing in the center. These are not new 3D reconstructions of avian vocal organs, and then also fossil vocal organs, and how we bring together data on living animals into dialogue with fossil data. And all of this research is enabled by place-based research. And so that's what I'm going to finish with today, because I think a key concept behind Humboldt's research is the notion that it is place-specific and involves gathering multiple observations of many different kinds in a single location. And so these are just shots of fieldwork, mostly in South America and Antarctica. And I want to close today with an idea that I would be very interested in your feedback on, which is how do we promote synoptic, place-based research in this world today to enable the kind of research we need in the face of massive short-term global change. And so I want to bring a proposal. I actually came up with this some years ago, which is the notion that if you're going to put in your seismic monitoring devices in Colombia and you have a black hole of biodiversity in those regions, you deploy some kind of biologist, potentially a bioacoustician, that can take recordings in real time to inform how biodiversity is changing, maybe year to year, maybe over multiple scales, but simply to add to those data that inform our models of how species relate to tectonic changes, species diversity relates to climate change. So these were just things that I came up with that I wanted to close with today, because I think that conversations that are outside conferences, that are outside disciplinary spheres, can often be how we realize novel intersections and novel projects. And so that's what I wanted to close with today. And I've been short, so we have plenty of time to get back on track. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Julia. This is a great talk and a call to arms. If there are immediate comments for Dr. Clark, questions?
Thoughts?
Thoughts? Well, we're taking applications for sure on the Colombian black hole.
Well, I do some work in Colombia, and in fact, my colleague says, for example, in species of birds that they're critically underestimated. So the current estimates for things like tinamous, which are relatively cryptic species of bird, are like somewhere in the range, I think, of 6 to 10 in Colombia. He estimates that they're actually more like twice that diversity, and that on top of most of these mountain ranges across Colombia, there are new species of birds that have yet not been described. But if you're going there already, how about you throw a biologist in the car and we can make simultaneous observations and try to inform our world as it is right now in the face of global change. So that's it.
Sounds like a great plan. Thanks again to Dr. Clark and all of the speakers of the session. And Claudia, some closing words.
Thanks again for everybody to come to join us so late, and to the speaker. It was a really interesting session, looking at the work by von Humboldt in a different perspective. So it was very exciting. And just to remind you that we also are promoting a special volume on G-Cube, Geophysics, Geochemistry, and Geosystem. So we love to collect papers from the speakers, but also if there are proposals from the audience, other people that may be interested, we would love to have other work added to this volume dedicated to the 250th anniversary of von Humboldt. Thanks again for everybody to join us.